I see that civic ethic as having several elements. First, in policy debates, citizens should increasingly press their political leaders to talk globally, to indicate the broader international consequences of their preferred policies. All policies have such consequences, and some people, both inside and outside the boundaries of existing communities, will care deeply about those consequences when they are spelled out. And when political leaders are pressed to elaborate the extraterritorial impacts of policies harmful to outsiders, and those outsiders have supporters within the leaders' own countries, or when the outsiders themselves are in a position to push back against the nation for such policies, then the leaders' domestic opponents, as well as outsiders, can use these negative consequences of the proposals to criticize the leaders and press for different policies. And domestic opponents generally like to find arguments to use against their rivals, so you can imagine that they would pick up these themes of the harmful global consequences of their opponents' positions. And so a politics in which leaders feel compelled to talk about the global consequences of their actions will create political pressures for the leaders to make those global consequences as positive for all as possible if the leaders want to succeed. Now, I'll have to retract this argument if Donald Trump is elected president, since his rhetoric celebrates the harmful consequences of his policies for outsiders. But I think instead my claim will hold true, and he will not be elected. Second part of this political ethic, citizens should also subject political leaders' rhetorical claims for the supreme value of their nation, claims like American leaders' contention that their country has a kind of manifest destiny to lead the world. These claims should be subjected to the political equivalent of what American judges call strict scrutiny. Citizens should place a heavy burden of proof on those leaders making such contentions. One example right now of rhetoric that should be strictly scrutinized is the religious claims of leaders who say they and their nation act by divine authority. The call for strict, skeptical scrutiny of such claims is pertinent to radical Muslim positions, but also to some American claims. President George W. Bush made providentialist prophetic claims for America's global destiny in his speeches more often than any president in history. And Americans should have been more dubious of those claims than we were. Though claims for the supreme value of one's nation serve some valuable political purposes in inspiring allegiance and sacrifice, such claims always have a tendency to work against equal regard for other peoples and cooperative efforts with other communities. But the third part of this civic ethic is that citizens should also subject their government's denials of accommodations to regional, religious, cultural, racial, and ethnic minorities to this kind of strict scrutiny. One example in the United States today is the claims of conservative religious groups to exemption from public policies like requirements to pay for health insurance that covers contraceptives. In Europe, a leading example is the claims of Islamic groups to wear religious garb and symbols. A civic ethic inspired by the Million Aid Principle of not just permitting people to have multiple memberships, but actively helping them to realize their aspirations in multiple groups when it doesn't do harm to the majority. This kind of ethic clearly applies to those who believe they have religious duties that deserve to be accommodated. And I believe the same ethic applies in regard to any groups that people feel are vital to their self-fulfillment. And so, though it's not popular with American secular liberals dealing with the claims of conservative religious groups, and it's not popular with the French left as well as the French right, who demand considerable cultural assimilation by all residents, I think citizens should subject their government's rejections of claims for special accommodations to strict scrutiny. Governments must prove that particular accommodations would really be harmful to vital social interests before saying no. And even when they must say no, they should seek to find alternative accommodations that would be less damaging to vital social interests. Simply dismissing claims by saying those groups' values are different than ours is not enough, or should not be enough. This argument applies, I believe, to at least some claims for Hong Kong to have a distinctive economic and political status within China. Not all such claims may be defensible, but given Hong Kong's special history and circumstances, denials of some kinds of accommodations need to be supported with strong justifications. Citizens participating in politics in ways consistent with this civic ethic would, I believe, help over time to create policies and political attitudes favorable toward the development of a world of more interlocked, flexible, moderate peoples rather than a Westphalian system of closed sovereign states. To summarize why this is so, if political leaders felt compelled to discuss openly the transnational consequences of their actions, often the case for more widely beneficial policies and for cooperation with other communities via treaties, associations, even formal federation, will seem stronger than decisions to focus solely on the nation's own interests. If political leaders are pushed to defend their claims that their nation's values and interests are supreme over all others, they may find that they cannot do so in ways that are widely persuasive, and so they may have to acknowledge that policies and institutions that give weight to the concerns of outsiders as well as insiders, without harming insiders, are more legitimate. If political leaders are called to justify denying the group aspirations of religious, cultural, ethnic, or regional communities, aspirations which may well be for greater policy accommodations, or for greater community autonomy within nation states, or even for rights to affiliate across national boundaries, again, leaders may conclude it is more feasible to permit people to live simultaneously in multiple communities with some diversity and flexibility in their rules and practices than it is to repress diversity. At a minimum, if citizens put these kinds of demands on their leaders, we are less likely to get policies that unapologetically focus solely on the interests of a nation's own people without any regard for others who are suffering around the globe. We are also less likely to get policies that demand absolute allegiance to a single sovereign, instead of allowing people to pursue lives with respect for the authority and values of most, if not all, of the multiple groups that are meaningful to their fulfillment. I think we will move toward a more tolerant, more peaceful, more fulfilling, more free and equal and better world. I know for certain that the United States has become a significantly more diverse, multicultural nation with greater openness to dual citizenships, to multilateral policymaking, to accepting the authority of international institutions in my lifetime, and that we are better for it, though we still have much to overcome before we will relinquish our claims to ultimate sovereignty. And I've recognized throughout this talk that changes in these directions are probably still more difficult in China. And again, I very much believe that political communities often should preserve distinctive features of their common identities, their own special stories of their own peoplehood, if they are truly to aid and advance the aspirations of their members. Though I think nations around the globe need to move in the general directions of more flexible and fluid forms of semi-sovereign peoplehood I have sketched, they will surely need to do so in different ways and at different rates, and some will inevitably be more or less diverse, inclusive, and open than others. Still, if even the United States can moderate its beliefs that it is so exceptional that it need not cooperate with the world, then there is some hope that progress toward moderate forms of political peoplehood is a realistic aspiration in many communities and many regions of the world today. Whether that is so here in Hong Kong and in China more generally, and whether it should be, I will be grateful to hear from you. And I thank you for listening so courteously to me.